the green criminology crew here, and others who are interested in climate change issues and maybe electric vehicle issues. So um, I wanted to first of all acknowledge that I developed this presentation where I work and where I live and sometimes where I play on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands and waters of the Kwantlen, the Musqueam, the Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kakite, and Coquitlam, and other allied Coast Salish peoples. Um, Yesterday, I had a chance to join in a biology and indigenous studies cross-listed course, 1492, biology 1492, and it was I had a chance to take my students to join Lee Beavington, and we learned a lot from Lakaten, and um, it really inspires me every time I hear him speak, and so I just wanted to also acknowledge that his role as our elder in residence at the Kwantlen Polytech University. Lydia, go ahead. So thanks, Lydia, for sharing the slides. We might not always be in sync, so I just wanted to let people know that I'm using my Mac and I haven't used it for this purpose, but I wanted to use it because it was usually more reliable. So um, I'm coming to you from our 72nd Avenue campus. So today, this is the title of my talk. There's 3 photos on the top, and I'm going to talk about those in sequence. So let's go to the next slide, please. And this is sort of the quick sketch of my talk. It's fairly straightforward, but I'll provide some context in terms of what I'm talking about, a little bit of clarity about what I mean by mobilities justice and the frameworks that I'm using. I won't talk so much about climate justice frameworks, but I'll allude to the importance of it in relation to mobilities justice. There's kind of overlapping many justice frameworks, right? Whether it's related to procedural or utilitarian justice or distributive justice, but I'll focus on this concept of mobilities justice, and in relation especially to what I'm terming and what many scholars are now terming electromobilities, right? Electrified mobility or movement in and around cities, and the right to mobility, or what's sometimes called motility with a T, right? So I'll try not to mix those two up. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the current issues that are shaping this, especially south of the border with the politics there, but also the broader issue, what's going on our shared planet. And then maybe some quick conclusions if we have time. I might skip over a few of those. I'll just kind of give you some directions because this, in fact, is sort of an ongoing work in progress. Next slide, please. So the context, as the title alludes to, we're referring to this climate crisis, and there's a lot of photos in here that I've intermixed with my own photos, and there's a few where I'll always try to give credit where credit is due. There was one photo that I couldn't find where I got it from, and I was spending, I don't know, undue amounts of time at like strange hours in the morning trying to find it. But so I was trying to be fastidious about the references. But if you see something amiss or you're wondering about anything, just let me know towards the end of the talk. Or at any point in the talk, really, if you have any questions. I took these pictures on the left from Lytton and Nakhlan territories, and the Lytton, as many of us know, in 2021 burned to the ground essentially, or as you can see, not much is left of the old main street of Lytton. And this picture on the right is illustrative of the fire, but I thought it was also illustrative of some of the points I'm trying to make in this talk, the links, the visual and visceral links to climate change, right? Someone's driving, it looks like they're driving into the fire, but they're probably driving away from it with, it looks like an SUV. So that link, I'm trying to make the links between automobility and especially electric mobilities or electromobilities and climate change, and about some of the choices that are being made right now. And that's something I want to get into more in this research. Next slide, please. I won't be doing that today, of course. So this is sort of some sketching of some research that I've been working on for the past few years with colleagues at Concordia University and some international colleagues who were working on a paper to submit to mobilities. And it came from this journey that I took to Italy in 2022 to a beautiful city, Padua, which is closer, Padova, I think they say in Italian. It's closer to Venice. It was actually at one point in the Venetian League. But I was in Rome before I went to Padova. I'd never been to Rome before. And in the neighborhood where I was staying, I was walking back and I noticed this unusual, so you'll see in my slides these sort of cross-cutting themes often. And this one just really stood out because it was an electric charging station next to a real estate agent. That's the bright lights in the background. And arguably some of the places that they had up there, responsible for, it's the Trastevere neighborhood. It's very, very much gentrifying. But more importantly, the human element in the foreground of the real estate building, there's someone sleeping. There's a rough sleeper or perhaps a homeless person, right, sleeping there next to all of these things, right? So the juxtaposition of urban space, contestations over urban space, real estate gentrification, and then at a charging station in Italy, right, where arguably the charge is not some sort of clean electrical charge, right, probably from a coal-fired power generating station or a gas-fired generating station. But moreover, there's the class issues as well, the juxtaposition of class issues, right? The amount of money that it takes to run and purchase a car, the capital and operating costs, the charging in front of a real estate space where someone is homeless, right? Those juxtapositions really stood out to me as characteristic of a lot of mobility's justice issues that come up when you start looking at either questions of opportunity cost, expenditures forgone, or policy choices made, right? Whether it's participatory budgeting or the lack of participation, democratic participation in budgeting and policy making processes. Next slide, please. And I took this picture a few years ago when I think it was the first time I had a chance to ride in an electric vehicle. We were going biking, strangely enough. So it was electromobilities to get us to velomobilities, right? Which is sometimes known as biking mobilities. And there's a whole literature on velomobilities as well. But we were cycling up in and around Stalo territories in what is known as Chilliwack along the Vetter Canal, right? I think it sounds like a Dutch name. These sort of canals where you can bike for quite a long ways. And so we parked up near a co-housing project near Yarrow. And my friend has a very much a sixth sense of where all these electric charging stations are. He doesn't even need to use an app to find them because he uses them on a regular basis. So he knew about this station. But what struck me was it had plastered all over it Rio Tinto Alcan, right? Obviously a mining kind of firm, right? And I just thought to myself, this is very interesting, right? Instead of going to an Exxon or a Chevron or a Royal Dutch Shell or a British Petroleum station, we're going to, a mining company's station to get energy, right? So to speak. I don't know what role Rio Tinto, maybe they just, had a minor role, but I think the way their name was placed, it raised some new questions about the political ecology and political economy of electromobilities, in my mind at least. Next slide, please. So those three pictures, to sort of use them as a kind of a jumping off point, a leaping off point, these are some of the questions that I'm raising in my research interest in electromobilities, and especially this question of justice. Is this unfolding of an electrified mode of mobilities through vehicles, cars, and other types of, other types like trucks and whatnot, other types of forms of mobility, increasingly things like bikes, two-wheelers, three-wheelers in places like where I've done research before, like in India, and I'll allude to that. Whether it's 2, 3, or 4 wheels, whether it's bikes or vehicles, we're seeing this global move to electrify. But it's sort of juxtaposed with these questions about climate in the background, right? So is there going to be a smooth transition as we move towards electromobilities, or is it going to be something where we're actually disinvesting in internal combustion engines, but we're investing in private electrified mobilities, versus what I'm arguing for is more that we need to be looking at what are the opportunities foregone in investing, for example, in electrified transit, or even just regular transit, right? Diesel or gas transit, which some statistics show is actually still a lot more carbon friendly. A big bus is a lot better, even if it's diesel, at reducing our per capita carbon footprint, according to some data, than an individual electric vehicle choice. So how can we get to do some kind of analysis on this? And one of the models that I'm looking at is this notion of metabolic shift or metabolic rift, right? That there's a shift in what's going on in terms of electrical grid and electrical distribution of electricity, and how that's being partitioned, right? So in some ways, what I'm talking about is electromobilities equity. There's a question. I think someone has raised a question. Someone has their hand up. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yes. Sorry. Just before you move on from this frame, I wanted to quickly ask a question. If you could include it in your discussion of these infrastructure of EVs, and I wonder if you could quickly include. Perhaps it's not a fair question though, because it seems happenings around us over the last few weeks have seemed to supersede these very interesting projects that you're working on. But I wonder if you could quickly include the attack on Tesla charging stations, which have taken place over the last few days, as part of the reaction to the injustices of Trump's and Musk's behavior, not only in the US, but also in Canada. If you could quickly add that to your frame as part of this kind of tenuous relationship between transition to EV and injustice or justice, however you want to think of justice lately. So if you could just quickly include that in this frame.
Thank you for that intervention. And it actually, in fact, it is coming up.
Okay.
Well, it is coming up.
Okay.
So and I will try to. So I will try to cover it. So yeah, and if I maybe I should ask. Thank you for that good point, because I was, in fact, and I can talk about this later, but I did hear, of course, Chrystia Freeland talking about strategic interventions and suggesting, I believe it was this morning on CBC, it was reported that she was proposing that Canada target Tesla with a 100% tariff, right? So that's very interesting, right? And so, but I don't want to get into the weeds on this right now, because trade wars will take us into a direction that I don't want to do, because I've got a lot of slides. So can you hold your questions until the end of the presentation, just because of my train of thought, but also because I might answer some of your questions as my presentation unfolds.
Great. Let me quickly warn that I will leave at 1:30 because I have to go to class. So,
okay, so I don't know if I'll be able to get to your answer, but it is later in the slides, so I'll try to keep moving. Okay, great. Next slide, please. Thank you. You're welcome. And thanks for that intervention. It is actually useful to have those sometimes. Okay, so what do I mean by mobility is justice? Okay, so let's go ahead. Next slide, please. Well, a lot of the work on mobility is justice comes from the work of Yuri and Scheller, right? Mimi Scheller, I had a chance to meet her in Australia a few years ago. She did a wonderful talk down there. And this notion, they did a lot of work on her colleague Yuri, John Yuri, and Mimi Scheller both co-authored some work on automobility. And she's taken it to the next level and started asking questions, how is mobility unfolding? Is it unfolding in a just way? This role of the automobile in our lives, comparatively speaking, how does this relate to sort of the unfolding of planning for infrastructure for automobility versus other forms of transit, what we sometimes call, transportation planners sometimes call the modal split or the mode split, right? So these kinds of questions, how is mobility accessible? And they could be looking at mobility within the society in a broad sense, but they're often talking about transportation. Next slide, please. And I'm also linking it to the work on climate justice, right? So I'm not going to get into all of the frameworks for climate justice, but suffice to say, there are a lot. A lot of it has to do with access to energy, energy poverty, but it also has to do with the way we're reshaping our spaces in relation to climate mitigation and adaptation strategy. Is it happening in a just way, right? Is it happening? Are we having full engagement of different communities? And do they see? Do those communities, especially workers, do they see a safe transition for them in terms of employment and employability, right? So that's something that is one aspect of justice. Another aspect, I like to use Nancy Fraser's idea of the scales of justice, right? Where we're not just looking at the balance or procedural justice or even distributive justice, but we're also looking at scalar justice, right? The differentiation between the global north and the global south, the traditional colonial models of resource exploitation. So those aspects come out in both climate justice frameworks, but also in mobilities justice frameworks. I'm interested in the intersection of the two. Next slide, please. So you can see in a lot of, this is just sort of a quick sampling of headlines over the past few years about how the implications for both mobility and climate justice issues, right? Pickup trucks are a plague on Canadian streets, right? There was also a study, Barry Sassafrage of the National Observer identified the work of the International Energy Agency in identifying how Canadian vehicles. In Canada, we have at that time, I think it was around 2020, 2021 when that came out. At that time, Canada was cited by the IAEA as having the most gas guzzling vehicles, the largest vehicles on average, the most gas guzzling on average, and the least fuel efficient, right? So one quick strike could just be improve fuel efficiency standards, right? But the bigger issue is this is definitely a raison d'etre for transitioning to electrified private vehicles, right? To address those challenges. But the argument that I'm making is that we're not going to be able to do it on a wholesale level. And what are the public subsidies and the public goods that are being invested, and what will be the impacts on, say, public transit, right? So also related to vehicles, we have road infrastructure, right? And as an urban planner, as an urban geographer, I find that this question is actually one of the most important, and it's often rarely discussed in relation to electric vehicles, but also in terms of the transition. For years, planners have been talking about the need to move away from suburban models of growth to more, intensive models of growth, more infill development, more compact cities, the 15-minute city, and these types of things, right? And a lot of that involves developing perhaps more walkable communities, more bikeable communities, but also more public transit connected communities, right? And so if we're investing so much in infrastructure, in large highway projects to facilitate the movement of private vehicles, then there tends to be something called a path dependency, right? Economists like to call it that. This path dependency where you have a lock-in effect, where you become more and more dependent. There's sort of a positive feedback where with negative results, where you become more and more dependent on a certain type of infrastructure, auto-oriented infrastructure, which is very expensive and very costly. And more importantly, it's again another investment foregone. That billions spent on highway projects or highway widening could have been spent on transit and especially electrified transit. Next slide, please. So there's been a long-standing history of mobilities activism, right? Whether it's in the United States, the bus riders union in LA trying to fight for better service, better lower prices, and so on and so forth. Reducing the fare box fees. Vancouver has a long history of this as well, right? I used to participate in critical mass bicycle demonstrations years ago, right? And the then mayor and various city councilors joined us. So there became a political impetus at City Hall to transform the infrastructure of Vancouver, at least with a focus on velo mobility, bikeability, right? But hand in hand with that is also improved public transit, right? Because we are in a large city region, and biking, it may not be feasible if you're living in North Van trying to bike to, say, KPU. It just may not be feasible. So improving transit options becomes very important for any large metropolitan area has polycentric or multiple centers of activity, employment, and housing, and so on. Next, please. So in Vancouver, there's definitely has been a vision for how there could be an expanded transit system, right? A massive network of light rail transit and bus rapid transit. You know, we've seen the I take the R6 for example, and it's really changed movement and the placemaking along the Scott Road corridor all the way to Newton Exchange, right? And my students have engaged in various exercises to re-envision, you know, urban mobility, re-envision, what do we call it, urban climate justice in Surrey Central as well, right? So, you know, there are hubs in Metro Vancouver, as we know, where there's good transit, where there's good interchange and nexus locations, but there needs to be a lot more of a build out of that network, right? So shouldn't be so reliant on just one single spine, which is going to be extended to Langley eventually, right? It also, the big issue with transit though, expanding that system is cost problematic, right? It's been very much the case. We've had a situation where agencies like TransLink are actually lobbying higher levels of government for funding in their advertising, right? Yeah, I used to see an ad all the time at Scott Road Station where it's like, you know, if you want better transit, if your buses are too crowded, contact your MP, contact the federal government. And I sort of thought this is a bit unusual, right? But it's kind of a form of agency activism. TransLink recognizes the situation. It's an agency that's provincially sanctioned. It's a creature of the province, but it also requires three levels of cooperation: federal, provincial, and local, and not to say consultation with First Nations as well. And so TransLink needs to get more money, and that's the case with transit authorities around the world often, right? Unless they have good financing tools. I did do my PhD in Hong Kong, right? So there are some examples of jurisdictions, and I did postdoc work in Singapore where they have electronic road pricing, right? So there are jurisdictions that have found ways to raise money, but it often becomes an issue, especially in a car-oriented culture where, you know, especially in the suburbs where 80% of people, 85% of people, even 90% of people regularly drive a car to work, to other things, right? Because of the urban morphology, because of the shape of the city. So unless you're living in the city of Vancouver, where closer to 40% of people, 45% of people regularly use public transit or bike or walk, it becomes difficult to convince politicians because they don't see it in their political interests, right? And we've seen this with things like the referendum on raising funds for TransLink, or the tolls that were taken off the Port Mann Bridge because constituencies in the suburbs were seen to be potentially more favorable to taking off the tolls, and therefore for arguably more automobility, or at least funding for more automobility. Next slide, please. So these public choices about how electromobilities unfolds in relation to the existing suite of choices for transit is very important, right? What are the costs that are going to be foregone if we're investing, if we're subsidizing in certain modes? We do need to transition away from fossil fuels, right? Just because I'm arguing against excessive subsidies towards private automobility does not mean I'm arguing for staying with internal combustion engine, or what's sometimes known as ICEs, right? I'm not arguing for that, but I'm arguing that there are many reasons why we need to do the shift towards electromobilities, but strategically from a public choice theory perspective, from a cost benefit analysis perspective, from an equity perspective, the strongest impact could actually be in investing more strategically in triaging our investments in public transit. Next slide, please. And electrified public transit in particular. So of course, mobilities justice is taking in a lot of different considerations. So my colleague mentioned, you know, the current trade wars, but another one is the infrastructure for electrification, right? Not just the infrastructure, but the whole supply chain. I will show you another slide. So this is one, right? How will the infrastructure unfold? Is there equity even in the accessibility, right? One might argue, well, if you can afford an electric car, is equity such an issue, right? But it is an issue. This is a paper from colleagues in the US. Next slide, please. So there is research on charging equity. There's also impacts in terms of the life cycle, the impacts of mining that's used to create the batteries, right? This is some interesting work by Rio Francos and colleagues out of the University of California at Davis, or Davis, California. and they're looking at the impacts. They're saying, they're making this argument with the title, and you can see in the contents as well, right? They're looking at aspects of the battery life cycle, where it's made, where the mining is taking place, where the minerals are being sourced from, what are the human rights assessments of this, what are the social and environmental impacts of more mining. And their argument is that there needs to be more mobility and less mining, right, to simplify. Next slide, please. So I took this picture in Richmond, but this is a common picture that you could take anywhere in Canada, right? Almost 1/3 of our land use, particularly in suburban areas, is devoted to the private automobile, whether it's internal combustion or electric. So my argument is that we need to also, in the simultaneous shift towards electromobilities and electrifying our cities and electrifying our infrastructure increasingly and electrifying all forms of mobility, we need to do that whilst we grow more compact and actually have less cars, period, including electrified cars. So that's the argument for mass public transit. Next, please. As well as other forms like electric bikes and so on. And we need to keep in mind that just because we're introducing new technologies, many people would argue, well, electric cars are potentially safer. They might brake more rapidly. They might have automated systems that are more effective. These vehicles are quite heavy, right? If you have an electric SUV, they're very heavy. They're very quiet. And they can accelerate super fast. What could go wrong, right? Sometimes their drivers seem to be highly distracted, in my view, too. But maybe they're trusting in the automated system. But the issue of zero accidents in our cities is a big one, right? I just was involved with an argument on a blog, a bicycle blog in Surrey. It wasn't so much an argument, but an interesting discussion, debate about Surrey seemingly ditching its zero road accident policy. And the argument was that, Surrey has zero vision, right? I think it was called Vision Zero. And the idea of Vision Zero is to have zero crashes, zero accidents, zero kids killed, zero anyone killed, cyclists or pedestrians on roads, on public roads, right? And, so that it raises the question, how can we make our streets more complete? Streets are shared infrastructure. I don't own a car. I choose not to own a car, but I pay out of my taxes a larger proportion that goes to roads largely for private automobility. People might say, well, there's buses on the roads as well. Well, maybe we need more bus lanes, right? So next, please. So the issue, urban geographers and urban planners are very much interested in this morphology and this trajectory of sprawl. What are we moving towards as we shape our policies, right? My argument is that if we become path dependent on subsidizing electric vehicles, right, on subsidizing the purchase of them, on subsidizing electric vehicle battery plants, like we've done to the tune of billions of dollars in Ontario, as reported by the PBO, right, the Parliamentary Budget Office. If we continue to dump all of this money into this electric golden horse, or whatever you want to call it, I can't think of a good metaphor right now, but if we continue to do that, then we're missing out important issues about land use, about urban sprawl, and about compact communities. Next slide, please. And also about the possibilities of more transit-friendly cities. Was there another slide before that, or not? Yes. Okay. So I think this slide is just talking about transit systems, and we actually have a, even though I was dissing Vancouver's transit system, and if you get to know me, I spend a lot of time doing that, but actually compared to many cities in North America, we have a pretty good system, right? So I think I was spoiled before I came to KPU because I was living in Taipei. I was living in Hong Kong and Singapore, and I was also doing work in Delhi. And all of those places have built in a very short order vast and complex transit systems that work very effectively, right? But this is something we need to talk about later on maybe not in this presentation, but in my research, I'm very interested in the trade-offs that we're making. If we're investing in private electrification, why aren't we strengthening our transit systems, right? We just saw the federal government announce to TransLink, I believe it was $600 or $700 million over 10 years, right? Well, that's the actual operating cost that TransLink needs each year, right? And so it's kind of one of these disconnects where the federal government makes it seem like they're making a really great announcement, but actually translates like, yeah, that's what we need just for 1 year. Next slide, please. So these questions of investment priorities become really important. If we compare mobility splits in cities around the world, I'm sorry, this is very small, and I'm going to actually turn off my camera just so I can lean in. Well, actually, no, I won't. I'll take off my glasses. Okay, so you can see here on the slide on the left, it's basically a comparison between three modes of transit, right? Active mobility, which is essentially walking or biking or sometimes called micromobilities, like on scooters. The second one, the middle one, is public transit, and the bottom one is cars, right? And essentially what it's showing is, maybe not to our surprise, which shows geographers have better infographics in my view than statisticians, right? If you go, I mean, we have to do both, I know, but if you go over to the right and you look at the map, that's sort of explaining it in many ways in terms of space and time, right? Or at least space. So it's showing, in North American cities and European cities tend to be more car dependent, right? Whereas other cities have much stronger transportation use ratios compared to other mobilities splits or choices. Next slide, please. So understanding that, that was sort of what I was alluding to with the politics between, say, the city of Vancouver and, say, the city of Surrey, where you have very different modal splits in terms of what people do, right? So it's very hard to change the political dial if the politicians know that there's an existential risk of being voted out of office if you do something that upsets the car drivers, right? And these kind of triangles also show the same type of thing, right? They're just comparing cities around the globe where there's active, more people, more individuals using active transit, active mobility or public transit in comparison with private automobility, right? On the blue notes on the bottom right-hand side of the left triangle. So that blue zone down there is basically mostly North American cities dominated by those percentages, and you can see the data on the right. I won't have time to go into that in detail right now. Next slide, please. So, okay, I've sketched some of the context about what's motivating me in this kind of research, and what I'd like to sort of dive into. It sounds very thesis-like at this point because it's so broad. So obviously, I'm scoping it a little bit more with this paper that I'm working on with colleagues at Concordia and elsewhere. One of the things we're looking at is the comparison of mobilities in the global south. And that's one of the reasons why those triangles and those maps that I was showing are important, because they give us framework. Not only is it useful to sort of compare within the Canadian Federation of what different provinces are doing vis-a-vis electrification and the trade-offs with transit, but it's useful to go beyond our borders, right? To think beyond and sort of see what has been done elsewhere, because there can be a kind of path dependency. And the only way sometimes to sort of jolt ourselves out of that thinking is to sort of say, well, how did they do it in this other city? What were the conditions that enable that to happen? Next slide, please. So I've been fortunate enough to travel to do visiting research fellowships before I was at KPU and also during KPU. I went to Bergen, Norway, to the geography department there, and I was involved with some energy conferences. Once or twice. One was in person called Beyond Oil. And I had a chance to walk around Bergen, right? Bergen's the second largest city in Norway. And interestingly enough, it's not that large of a city, right? I think it's just under 1 million in the region. And it has a new light rail transit. You probably heard a lot about Norwegian automobile electrification, but maybe what you haven't heard about is the transit electrification, right? They've electrified their trains. They've electrified trams and trolleys in the city. And they even have, I believe, electric buses as well, right? And so Norway has been doing a good job of it, but they've also come up with interesting models of linking this with land use and space and geography, right? So on the left is a picture of an electronic road pricing, it's in Singapore, they call it ERP, electronic road pricing gantry, right? It's a digital gantry. It's probably similar to the one that some of you may have experienced when they had those on the Port Mann Bridge, right? Now it's dormant. On the right, you see electric charging stations. The inner city of Bergen is very pedestrian friendly. It's very restricted. I think the residents only can park in these areas, right? Next slide, please. So the question that sometimes asked, and this is work by Peter Osborne and Ryan Beitz at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and they were working with Neil Brenner. I don't know if he's still at Harvard, but Brenner and Christian Schmidt came up with a lot of work on planetary urbanization, and they talked about the impacts, the impacts of infrastructure and technologies on cities and beyond cities, right, in the so-called hinterland. So Osborne and Betts, with that in mind, were looking at planetary carbonscapes, and they did a really interesting slideshow. I can't find this online anymore, so I saved it somewhere, but it did a really interesting kind of life cycle comparison of lithium's impacts and where it was mined and so on and so forth. So alluding to those electromobilities justice issues that I was talking about. Next slide, please. And they go into some detail into looking at the components of the current components of batteries, right? What's often not talked about is the recycling, right? And this is often the case. We see industry and corporations will promote a new pathway, a new technology, and then recycling is an afterthought. It's an externality, right? This becomes an issue, especially if we're talking about a major shift away from internal combustion engine to electrification, but also in places that don't have green grids. Is the electricity green? What then are the implications for materialities and for life cycles and for recycling products, whether it's batteries or the vehicle? Next slide, please. So the justice questions get more on the ground. They touch down in very specific places, right? Whether it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is right now there's an active war in the eastern part of the Congo, but there's also lots of issues about in many places where mining is occurring. Is it a kind of a blood form of mining, right? Instead of blood diamonds, is it blood mining? And we see this in terms of human rights issues in mining, right? And Canadian mining companies are not strangers to these kinds of questions, right? They often refer to social license, but we've seen it with mining and Indigenous peoples around the world. I have an interest in human rights because I'm our human rights and international solidarity rep, right? So this question of justice really touches down. If we're looking at a metabolic shift away from petroleum and oil and gas, or fracked gas, as we are doing in BC, if we're talking about a shift away from that, is the alternative equally benign in its full life cycle and the way it manifests itself in territories beyond cities, but also in cities? Next slide, please. So that's part of this notion of framing this as in terms of global local, right? So I think a spatial frame is a very helpful way to go. Next slide, please. I'm going to have to go a little bit faster because my time's we're pressed for time. This is some of the research I was doing in India. I think the point with this slide is I took this picture on the left. It was very fascinating to do work there in India, and I felt very privileged to be working with Govind Gopakumar, who was my advisor at Concordia. He's trained as an engineer, and we were looking at this one particular piece of infrastructure on the left. The image on the right is actually a different schematic for an infrastructure in Bangalore or Bengaluru, but the traffic was supposed to go in the same direction the woman is walking in, actually. But we see these kinds of different mobilities, the way people use infrastructures in different societies. It's an important thing that we need to recognize if we're talking about mobilities, injustices or justices, right? What I've seen in my travels most recently was in Asia in the fall. I had a chance to do a visiting fellowship, fellowship in, it's not a fellowship. I was granted funds to do an SDG research position in Indonesia, and a visiting position. And basically, I went there just for a very short time. But when I was in Indonesia, I had a chance to sort of see quite a bit of electrification, two-wheel electrification. And in India, you're seeing three-wheel electrification. So how does this relate to movement in and around cities and the access to battery energy? Next slide, please. So in India, for example, there are a lot of really interesting policies to push for electrification, right? The current Indian government is working with the Rocky Mountain Institute out of the United States and attempting to sort of identify ways that India can move towards a so-called clean economy, right? And move towards battery mobilities in some cases, right? So there was quite a number of studies that are available. Next slide, please. So I'm also looking at this notion of policy mobilities. What kinds of policies are being mobilized around the globe. So one of the things that we've seen in Canada is this push for jobs, right? And as we're seeing, I'll allude to the trade war now, as we're seeing in Canada, we're most vulnerable when it comes to energy exports and auto exports, right? Those two key themes that I'm talking about in this very talk. And so we've seen when the Biden administration was in power, there was a push through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was originally supposed to be the Green New Deal, but it was stonewalled by Senator Manchin, who has oil and gas interests in his constituency, so to speak. That Inflation Reduction Act still was one of the largest investments in electrification and transit in American history, right? So it was a large pulse of money going towards that. In turn, as a response, the Canadian government and the current Liberal administration invested heavily in electric batteries, right? Electric battery plants, that is, electric battery manufacturing. And they tried to woo different manufacturers to come into Canada. According to the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, their data, this is actually from 2 years ago, or 2023. It was an estimate of 43.6 billion with a B dollars were invested in, were subsidized, essentially given as a grant to these manufacturers, right? How much could you do for electric transit, right? With trolley buses, that makes me wonder. So those opportunity costs become clear and this doesn't even include subsidies to individuals, right? Subsidies to individuals who may be purchasing a car versus taking transit. I always wonder, why does someone who's purchasing a $40,000 car, and there are a lot more than that, I believe, a low-income person even getting a subsidy for that and not getting a subsidy to take transit or to purchase a bike? Next slide, please.
David, I just wanted to jump in because we've got 13 minutes left, and I know you've got quite a few slides left. It would be nice to have some time for if people have questions. I don't know how you feel about.
Yeah.
Do you think you could summarize things in the next few minutes, and then we would have time for questions? Yeah, let's do
that. We'll just flip through these slides. I'll just talk maybe briefly to each slide. So, I'm interested in what's happening around the globe. So, there's a lot of interesting things going on. For example, in Africa. Next slide, please. In terms of startups, but also in terms of policies. And this is some of the work that one of my research students did last year. Aaron Wu and I worked on this, and he did a really nice literature review looking at this question. What are the public investments involved in subsidizing electrified buses or in moving towards electric buses versus electric cars, right? So he did a literature review on this, and I can share that with you separately. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is this question of electromobilities equity, right? And I borrowed this on the left. This is a really interesting equity framework for evaluating energy use, consumption, and the way it's being distributed. And it's based on kind of the sustainability model. But I also think that we need to triage, kind of an inverse triage, I call it. So I developed this very simplistic schematic where we're looking at, if we're going to invest in electromobilities, if that's the public policy goal, we want to optimize that. Are we investing first in public investments? Are they going towards mass electromobilities? And then if not that, are they going towards mass transit, which still is arguably more effective in terms of climate change? And then if we're going to have remaining funds, public funds, then we could invest in private electromobilities infrastructures. Next slide, please. So a reverse triage notion. The frameworks could, the way to spend the money, there's a lot of frameworks available, not just a cost benefit analysis, but more complex frameworks that look at sustainability, that look at health, public health, accessibility, livelihood, right? Cost should be another factor. Next slide, please. So this was, our colleague had to leave, but this was sort of what I alluded to in terms of the trade wars. Next slide, please. So we need to think about scenarios, if we are in a state of business as usual. Currently, the business as usual is the bulk of subsidies for electromobilities appear to be going towards private electromobilities, right? That is the infrastructure, the life cycle, the battery, the subsidies to the battery plants. These are a lot of public funds have been involved with that, and policies, right? We want to get to mass electrification in places by 2030, 2035, right? California is a leader in this. And California has invested in electric buses, and they've got some strategies there as well. So we need to think about what's going on in tandem, not just thinking about private cars, which are very sexy, and the thought leaders tend to drive cars, right? And so do politicians. Next slide, please. So we need to think about those broader implications. Next slide, please. And recognizing that there is a market for this. Once McKinsey gets involved, the Davos crowd, there is a market for electromobilities. So we're seeing the future marketing and monetizing of electromobilities. And in my view, a lot of this is happening with the silencing of the lack of investment in public transit, whether it's electric or not. Next slide, please. So if we are in a trade war scenario, which we appear to be now with the tariffs, I mean, it changes by the day depending on which side of the bed Trump wakes up on. But, we've had an auto pact before. So we need to think very carefully about how these subsidies are being perceived in terms of trade relations, in terms of labor, right? If there is going to be a transition to electromobilities, will there be job losses to those making internal combustion engines? I would argue that, and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has also argued in a recent proposal that there needs to be an aggressive green industrial strategy. Why not also focus, if we're subsidizing billions for private automobility that's electrified, why not invest in revitalize some of our bus plants like we had in Thunder Bay, Bombardier, working with other companies or nonprofits, right? Vancouver Community College has had an investment from the provincial government, not just in electric car maintenance programs, but also in electric transit, right? So we need to think about that aspect. Next slide, please. If we are going into a trade war, if we have made in Canada, that would help a lot, I think. Other countries are doing this. They're setting targets. Canada's been setting targets. There needs to be some coherence, though, in terms of the relationship, right? In India, the focus tends to be on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. Next slide, please. Let's just go, next slide, please. We can go more quickly through these. Yeah, and there's a lot of policy mix, a lot of different policies with different countries around the world. Next slide, please. In terms of their supporting for electric. And we see that the data show us that electrified transit is far more effective. Next slide, please. In terms of energy efficiency, in terms of carbon impact, and especially if it's things like buses, right? Rapid transit buses, which can be sort of set up very quickly, less infrastructure, less capital costs. Next slide, please. In comparison with individual choices. So if we're in climate chaos mode, I would prefer that my tax dollar gets spent on mass transit. Next slide, please. And the conclusions, I won't talk about those in too much detail. Let's just go to the visuals because that will help me wrap up. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one, sorry, that one. This is one way I'm framing these issues with a global, local perspective, a so-called global perspective, where it's a multi-level analysis. I'm looking at climate change governance and mobilities governance at multiple levels, right? So I've talked about city level here, but I'm framing it, it's often nested in relation to subnational, national, multilateral, and global. Next slide, please. So to me, this work by Wilt says a lot, right? The struggle continues. He's comparing the revolutions in automobility and saying, these are some of the things that we need to focus on and that transit could actually bring us. It's proven in terms of being able to address these issues. You can take me to the final slide. I'll just conclude with that because we want to leave some room for questions. Sorry that I cut into the question time so much. That last one is fine. Go back one to the thanks slide. It's the very last slide. It says thanks. And yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, David. A very rich presentation in the sun here. Are there questions for David? Holly, and then Mark.
Hi, David. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. So I am completely on board with everything you said when it comes to cities. But whenever there are these discussions about mobility and electric vehicles, and the focus is always on mass transit, there is little discussion of rural communities and what they are supposed to do. And it is a particular red flag to me when they're talked about in terms of the hinterland. So I'm curious whether you could say a bit more about how that fits into the picture that you've described here.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we have a mobilities crisis in rural BC, right? My dad lives in the Okanagan, and I'm always saying, why do you live there? You know, as you're getting older, you're in a place that I can't access to you by transit. I have to get a rental car. And as you get older, it becomes an issue, right? Moving around. So, you know, I think the answer is it's going to have to be private electrification for now, but there are small buses that can be used, right? And there's some interesting models, right? There is a picture in somewhere in here, but I don't want to look for it right now. But Hope has this car sharing model where it's like volunteers volunteer their car and their time, right? So you could have someone with an electric van and they're, you know, picking up people. And I think those things are more realistic in smaller rural communities. But we also have, you know, in smaller cities, we need more investment in transit. Like I mean, it's shocking. Victoria, you know, had a great transit system, you know, with trams and trolleys and such. But and even in Vancouver, right? 100 years ago, I always show students the map. 100 years ago, we had more electrified transit per capita in Metro Vancouver than we do today, right? Because we had the BC Hydro was running the transit system basically, right? You had the electric rail, the electric tram and trolley. So I think in rural communities, in Canada, they used to be more connected by trains. My dad also worked for CN besides working for Transport Canada. And, you know, he was a station agent and he sort of saw the writing on the wall as people started flying more and people started taking their cars, right? So now the thing that I'm constantly complaining about in Canada is that people have to drive to, you know, if you want to get somewhere in Western Canada to visit relatives or family or you're moving or whatever, you need to either fly or own a car. And that means it's a class issue right away, right? Because we ignore people who don't have either option. So I completely agree with you, Holly. And I didn't bring it into this framework, but it's totally fitting within a mobilities justice framework, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Super interesting talk as usual. I guess I have a question about social movements. I mean, you're talking about like a really profound societal transformation, right? Like, so like Holly, I agree with everything you say. It makes complete sense. And I'm just wondering, like in that, there's the slide where you've got like the local to global and the multi levels of governance and kind of inflection points or what have you. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on social movements and you know, where you think the greatest opportunity is for making change in that local to global kind of network. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but social movements, where do they fit in?
Yeah. Total sense. Great question. Thank you for that. And it's something that I've kind of neglected. And ironically, I came to a lot of these issues from social movements, right? Like I used to be involved in critical mass. The bike every Friday they would bike around and they would we would choke roads, right? We would choke car-oriented roads, and sometimes we had aggression from drivers, like, you know, especially if they could see the freeway ahead of them, right? We recognized that, ironically, urban canyons are limiting, you know, in the vision. And so sometimes you need to actually viscerally get out there on the streets to demonstrate, right? So, and we've seen this with effective political demonstrations not related to transit, protesters have gone to shut down freeways, right? And I found when I went to the U.S. Before Trump came into power, I went into the U.S. last year to Portland and Seattle, and I hadn't been down there since the WTO protests to Seattle in 1999, right? That's sort of showing when I last went down there. But there was all kinds of tents along the freeways. And I just thought, my God, like people are going to be dying there a lot sooner because they're breathing in all those pollutants on those high volume freeways. But so public roads as public spaces are very important for assembly, freedom of association, freedom of speech, right? And so I think that's a very interesting point that you raise. I think transit activists in Vancouver are on a continuum, right? Some are more radical, and I think over the years as Vancouver has gentrified, and also as Vancouver has improved its transit, people in the city of Vancouver are less cognizant of what's going on in the suburbs, right? And I think that there's a kind of maybe an ossification in some ways of those movements, because the critical mass, they really need to be protesting in the suburbs to try to get better biking infrastructure. But there is some interesting movement in transits, right? There is a group called Movement, Movement, right? It's a movement, but you can go to that, and they're fighting for busing, right? It's bread and butter, it's lunch bucket crowd, it's working class stuff, right? And it's the folks I see on the buses who take the bus every day, because car drivers don't see their privilege. They don't see how they influence decision makers. Decision makers are car drivers too, right? And very few of them ride the bus, right? You know, I remember Mike Dukakis, the presidential candidate who took the subway, right? People were like, wow, this is like every man, hoi polloi, right? But it's just, you don't see that anymore, right? So I think there needs to be some link with getting the politicians to ride on transit, right? Does Kevin Quinn ride on transit? He's the CEO of Translink. I hope he does. But I think that people need to ground truth these things, right? I'm a big fan of that. So movements, global, there's also this boomerang effect where, networking, like critical mass used to do that. I don't think it's happening in transit enough. And right now with this electromobility shift, if transit activists don't get together and network, we're going to miss out, because the electromobilities crowd is way more influential. That's why the billions have been going towards private auto subsidies. And we've got to look at when the bike subsidy was announced. It was announced late in the game, years after people had private car subsidies. Bike subsidies were oversubscribed. The government had a very small pot of money, and the website crashed. So to me, that's a complete injustice, right? Why didn't you have that before electric transit? Why didn't you have a big, massive budget? So there's huge inequities, right? I think Brazilian model, I don't know if Fabrício is here, but participatory budgeting is so needed when it comes to these questions.
All right. I remember the critical mass bike protests from the 90s, David. That's why I wrote that. I suddenly had a flashback. But we are at 2:03, so I guess we should leave it there. Thanks very much, David. That was fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you at the next Art Speaker Series on the 20th. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks.